So tonight I'm going to share with you a few highlights from my recent trip to Vienna to attend the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine, and a few highlights from this month-long trip that I did last November from Egypt, Russia, Finland, Latvia, Poland, and Romania. And I'm going to intersperse these trips with some more information about this problem of militarism. So the title of the talk is Making Space for Peace, addressing this Russia-Ukraine war. It is so important for us to make space for peace because we are facing a poverty crisis and a climate emergency. It's also really important for us to get more active and to build up the peace movement in Canada. And by the end of my presentation, you'll be impressed even more why this is so urgent for us to get more active, really roll up our sleeves and deal with this issue. So, you have homeless encampments here in Nanaimo. There are homeless encampments all across the country. In my community of Kitchener-Waterloo, there are 4 homeless encampments. This is a picture of the homeless encampment near where I live. On Tuesday of this week, I was in Vancouver and I did a 3-hour walk with drug policy and rehabilitation advocate Guy Felicella through the downtown east side to learn more about the crisis there, the opioid crisis, the poverty crisis, the homelessness crisis, and it is unbelievable. 7,500 people who are suffering with immense trauma, trapped in a drug crisis, in a poverty crisis, and in a housing crisis. It is really a form of violence. How we in Canada treat the most vulnerable, traumatized people in our community is directly linked to how we treat people in other countries, the violence of our foreign policy. Not only are we dealing with this poverty crisis, but we're all being impacted by this horrendous climate emergency. So there are 400 forest fires still raging across the country, from British Columbia to Saskatchewan, Alberta, Northern Ontario where I live, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. Many of them are out of control. The headlines a week and a half ago are millions of Canadians will face extreme fire danger this summer. This is an immediate security challenge for all of us. This is the #1 threat that we are facing, is catastrophic climate change. This is a headline from British Columbia. BC is burning through its wildfire budget well before the season even peaks. $200 million have been allocated by the province to deal with the forest fires, but they've already gone through the budget and we're only at June. We've had more forest fires in the past 2 months than we have in the past 2 years in Canada. And look at this statistic from the BC Wildfire Service. Over the past 3 decades, we've gone from an average of 300,000 hectares burning in this province annually to 2 million hectares of forest burning. This is climate-induced natural disasters. And we don't have enough resources to deal with these crises. In Alberta, while I was in Vienna, 100 forest fires burning, 30 of them out of control, thousands of people evacuated, hundreds of homes burned down. The same thing happening in Nova Scotia, the smoke blanketing the cities. In fact, it got so bad it was going down through the eastern seaboard. The headlines around the world showed orange smoke haze across Calgary and in New York City. At the same time that these forest fires were burning out of control in Alberta, the Canadian military was conducting its largest live fire weapons training in Wainwright Military Base, very close to Calgary. I was just in Calgary and you could still smell the smoke in the air. remember, for 3 days, people in Calgary could barely go out of their homes and walk their dog and exercise. And this is what our military was doing at the exact same time. So really look carefully at this picture. The live fire, the shooting, the shelling, the bombing. Look at the compaction of the soil. These tanks that they're training on, these Leopard tanks, the ones that we've sent to Ukraine, compact the soil, they damage the forests. They are making it more difficult for our communities to deal with the climate emergency, destroying our forests that try to absorb carbon. And Alberta, of course, didn't have enough resources to tackle the climate emergency. They had to fly in thousands of firefighters to come and help. And we've known this. We've known from the climate science that climate-induced natural disasters like forest fires, flooding, the heat dome, heat waves are going to get worse because we are not rapidly reducing climate emissions. But instead, in January of this year, our Defense Minister, Anita Anand, announced that Canada is going to buy a new fleet of fossil fuel-powered fighter jets, the F-35 fighter jets, for 88 of them for $70 billion over the next decade, which will lock us into 30 decades of carbon-intensive militarism, exacerbating the climate emergency. And also these fighter jets are for killing people and for destroying other countries. So this is the second most expensive procurement in Canadian history, and instead of spending our precious tax dollars on investing in the climate emergency, helping communities adapt and become more resilient, we are investing in new warplanes. So, in March of this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their 6th assessment report. So there is an 80-page summary report and then a 30-page report for policymakers. I really want to urge you to have a look at this report and bring a copy to your member of parliament. The theme of the report is urgent climate action can secure a livable future for all. The most important operative adjective here is a livable future for all. I want to show you a couple of graphs from this important report. The first one is this graph. Now look at the first arrow here at the bottom, and you can see global temperature change. This is the scale. At 0 degrees, it's white, and as it gets hotter to 4 degrees, it becomes more red, okay? So this is the scale that we're on right now. Where the red arrow is at the top is at 1.1 degrees of global mean temperature rise. This is where we are currently in 2023, okay? According to the IPCC scientists, with a high level of confidence, very high to high level of confidence, that at the current emissions rate, over the next 70 years, we are on track to be at 3 to 4 degrees of warming, okay, in the next 7 years, okay? So my children, I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, 2 boys, and within their lifetime, they are looking at a future of 3 to 4 degrees of warming. This is going to have a serious impact on our children and our grandchildren. We are at 1.1 degrees of global mean temperature rise, and we're facing things like heat dome, flooding, and out-of-control forest fires. I bring this to your attention because I want you to think very seriously about the real security challenges that we're facing and how important it is that we make federal decisions based on the real threats that we're facing, catastrophic climate change, okay? So this report also says that what we need to do to avert this climate catastrophe is rapidly reduce emissions over the next decade by half, 50% by 2030 to keep global mean temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, okay? And in order to do that, we need to rapidly decarbonize, we need to invest dramatically in climate mitigation and adaptation. So those are the most important things we need to be doing now. This is a graph from the World Bank that shows Canadian carbon emissions over the past 60 years, and you can see it's gone up and up and up. The Canadian government has failed to meet every single target under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And as the current modeling shows, and at our current rate of emissions, we are continuing to go up. We are not going in the right direction. So this is why this is the most pressing issue that we need to focus on, and we need to decarbonize. But one of the reasons why we are failing to address the climate crisis is because we are engaged in war and militarism that's extremely carbon intensive and extremely costly. So the Canadian military accounts for 61% of all federal government emissions. The Canadian military is exempted from reducing its emissions, even though it is one of the largest contributors in the country. It is also the largest employer and the largest landholder. And the Canadian military gets 30% of the departmental or program expenses. So too much money is going to the military. And we are engaged in too much fossil fuel powered militarism. The same month that the IPCC report came out, which was March 20th, a week later, the federal government released its budget for the upcoming year. And in that report, it showed that the department that's going to be getting the most money is the Department of National Defense. And you can see it says for investment in NORAD, this is new military infrastructure across the Arctic, hangars and runways and bases, for our new fighter jets and for our new warships, and a massive investment for new conventional weapon systems, and for more recruiting. In this federal budget, there is a special spotlight on Canada's new fighter jets. You can see that there. And in the federal budget, they mention Ukraine 63 times, but they only mention climate change 35 times. So you can see where the priority is for the federal government. And this is a graph, again from the World Bank, that shows military spending over the past 60 years. And it tracks similarly to our carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are going up, military spending is continuing to go up. And one of the big pressures on Canada to increase military spending is our membership in NATO. I don't have time to go into this in-depthly, but at our current rate of military spending, which is $27 billion US, if you convert that into Canadian funds, it's $35 billion. At this current level of military spending, we're at 1.1% of GDP, which is far below the NATO target of 2%. There is intense pressure for us to increase that military spending, even though it's gone up 70% over the past decade. Friends, if we are going to meet that 2% GDP target, for military spending, we are looking at spending about $45 to $50 billion on the military over the next decade. And we can't do that because we have to invest in the climate emergency and in the poverty crisis. So we really need to work together to try to stop this and turn this around. So you can see this is a chart from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. They came out with this report on trends on military expenditures in April of this year, and it shows that the US military gets the most money at $877 billion. That budget for the US military has not been audited by the US government in over 30 years. There is a massive amount of corruption in that figure. China is next at $292 billion. Then you can see Russia, $86 billion, less than 1/10 what the United States is spending on their military. And then you keep scrolling down and you'll notice that a lot of the countries are NATO members. And then you can see Canada ranked 14th highest. And this is global military spending over the past 30 years, and we're now at a record high of $2.2 trillion. And this is equivalent roughly to the amount that we need globally to invest in the climate emergency and to try to keep global mean temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and meet the Paris Agreement. So we really need to tackle this problem of military spending. Not only is Canada spending a lot on the military, Canada is also ranked 16th highest in the world for arms exports. 16th highest in the world for arms exports, and that has increased 30% over the past 2 years. So we send a lot of weapons to Ukraine, to Egypt, to Israel, to Bahrain, and to many other countries. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, with all of this military spending, surely Canada is doing some peacekeeping, because aren't we peacekeepers in this country? Isn't that what we're doing? Well, according to the latest UN peacekeeping office, Canada is currently ranked 70th in the world with only 58 soldiers wearing the UN blue helmet. Out of a force of 85,000, we are sending only 58 soldiers on UN peace support operations. And you'll notice below us, in ranked 77th is the United States, even though it is the largest military on the planet with 2 million personnel. It has only 36 soldiers on UN peace support operations. So we need to think critically about really what our military is doing. It's not doing peacekeeping. No. What it is doing is a lot of war making with the United States and with NATO. So in 2005, the Canadian military transformed with a slogan, "Fight with the Forces." And our Chief of Defense Staff at the time, Rick Hillier, said that the job of the Canadian military is to be able to kill people. Well, we have actually done a lot of killing. We were 12 years in a combat mission in Afghanistan. We led the NATO bombing of Libya that totally destabilized and destroyed one of the most prosperous countries on the African continent, leading to a refugee crisis with many drownings in the Mediterranean Sea. We bombed Syria and Iraq from 2014 to 2016. And we have special forces that are operating in the Middle East and in Africa with no parliamentary and public oversight. And since 2015, we have been engaged in something called Operation Unifier, which has been training, arming Ukrainian security forces in the country. And I'll speak more about that and how problematic that has been, because it has subverted the Minsk agreements and it has led to this conflict today. So we need to talk about NATO for a moment. NATO is not a defensive alliance. It's very much a US-led, nuclear-armed, offensive military alliance. It was formed in 1949 with the United States, Canada, and 10 other countries. Most of the other countries were colonial powers at the time. And over its history, particularly in the past 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Warsaw Pact, over the past 30 years, NATO was engaged in the illegal bombing of the former Yugoslavia in 1999, a brutal war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and now NATO is deeply involved, and Canada is deeply involved in this tragic, terrible war in Ukraine. So let's look now. Oh, I want to just go back for a moment, and I want you to look carefully. Take a moment and please look carefully at all of the blue countries in Europe are NATO members, right? Finland has just joined. Sweden is planning on joining, but I want you to pay attention very closely to where Belarus is and to where Ukraine is. Remember, at the end of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall came down, there was a promise made by the US administration to Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to Russia's border. And NATO is very much along Russia's border, and it has been over the past 25 years. But let's look at these two graphs these are graphs from NATO, and it shows NATO military infrastructure from the Baltics down to Bulgaria. So you can see there are thousands and thousands of soldiers, military bases, warships, missile systems that are not just defensive, they're also offensive, right along Russia's border. So this has been growing for the past 25 years. And then this is a graph that shows all of the military aircraft, all of the fighter jets, the bombers, the attack helicopters that are all in this region in Eastern Europe, again from the Baltics down to Bulgaria. And Canada sends fighter jets on a rotation. They fly from Romania to Poland and Germany, and they've been flying up and down Russia's borders for decades, okay? So just take a moment to put yourself as a Russian mother, as a Russian young person, as the Russian government, as a Russian opposition party. Put yourself in Russia's position for a moment. We need some strategic empathy, and look across your border and what do you see? And what do you see? Okay? Let's continue to carry on. So just keep this image and thought in your mind because we're going to address it again towards the end. So I spoke at the beginning of this presentation about the fact that we're in a climate emergency. Canada has just bought a new fleet of fossil fuel-powered fighter jets. Right now, NATO is engaged in its largest Air Force exercise in its history called Air Defender 2023. They have 250 warplanes that are flying, 10,000 personnel, and these fighter jets are flying up and down all over Eastern Europe, exacerbating the climate emergency, again, and very provocative towards Russia. When I was on this big trip into Eastern Europe in last November, I stopped in Latvia, and I went to go and see Canada's base just outside of Riga. It's called Camp Adazi. It's about half an hour from the capital. It's right in the woods. And as I was standing there investigating this military base, I could hear through the trees the shooting and shelling and the cracks of guns and bombs through the forest. And I went to the front of the gate there. It was heavily patrolled and monitored, and I said that I had a letter for the commander. It's a Canadian commander, and I said that I was here to let him know that as a Canadian, I represent not just myself, but many other Canadians that don't want to see this militarization in Latvia. And we want Canada to be investing in diplomacy and working towards to end this war, not on militarism. And I also spoke to some soldiers, and I had a little conversation with people, and I let them know that I was a peace activist, and I really want my country to be investing in something else, not this. And I stood with my sign that I carried with me all over, this pink sign, no to NATO, yes to peace and cooperation. And every country that I went in, I found the Canadian Embassy, and I also stood outside with my sign. I want to show you this picture. This is from Google Maps. This is an aerial perspective of Camp Adazi in Latvia. So I was standing there at the gate where the red dot is, and you can see how decimated the forest is here. It's decimated from the tanks, from the attack helicopters that are exercising all of the time. This is a multinational NATO battle group that Canada is leading, and it's actually going to expand to a brigade. And 3 days ago, our Minister of Defense was meeting with officials from this base, talking about how Canada is going to invest more in this base. But this war-making that we are engaged in is environmentally destructive, and again, is extremely dangerously provocative to Russia. And we really need to question why we're there. And we have been there for the past 7 years. So there's our Minister of Defense with some of the officials from Latvia bolstering the battle group. No consideration about the the climate and the environmental impacts of any of our militarism. So, on the weekend of June 9th and 10th, our Prime Minister and our Deputy Prime Minister made a surprise trip to Kyiv, to Ukraine, to announce a new weapons package, $500 million for more weapons to Ukraine. In the past year and a half, since Russia invaded, Canada has, in 1 year, has sent $1.5 billion of weapons to Ukraine, $6.5 billion to the Ukrainian state, $8 billion with no parliamentary and public oversight, and we are prolonging this war. Not $1 has been spent for diplomacy or for conflict mediation to end the war. We are very much prolonging this war, and we need to critically reflect on that question. Why is it that Canada is prolonging this war? But I just want to just quickly tell you that the way that I see it, and I have been investigating this and following this for more than a decade, that there are 3 layers to this conflict. The layer in the middle is the conflict that you hear about in the mainstream media. This is the dominant narrative. This is what you hear from the federal government and what you hear in the media, and that it's an interstate war between Russia and Ukraine. The layers of the war that you don't hear about is that at the bottom here is that it is also a civil conflict between the Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians in the West, a civil conflict between them and the Russian-speaking minority in the Donbass and in Crimea, and they make up about 20% of the population. And there has been conflict between these groups ever since the Maidan protests in 2013 and the coup that Canada and the United States were deeply involved in February of 2014. The other layer of this war that is also not recognized, hidden, overlooked, not acknowledged by our government, by our intellectuals, by our university professors, by the mainstream media. This other layer at the top is a long war launched by NATO against Russia, and it is very much to weaken and to dismantle Russia in the same way that NATO did to the former Yugoslavia in 1999. I'd like to bring a couple of resources to your attention. This book on the left here, War with Russia, by Stephen F. Cohen. Stephen F. Cohen was the most preeminent expert on U.S.-Russia relations in the United States. He was also an expert on U.S. foreign policy. He had been to Russia, the Soviet Union, for more than 40 years. He could speak Russian and read it. And the year before he died, the last book that he wrote was this book, War with Russia, ? From Putin and Ukraine to Trump and Russiagate. And this book is critically important, and it was a warning. He knew that the United States was creating the conditions for this war in Ukraine. The other book that I want to bring to your attention that is also vitally important is this book by Jacques Bode called Operation Z, The Hidden Truths About the War in Ukraine Revealed. And Jacques Bode is a recently retired colonel of the Swiss military, and he was also a senior intelligence officer for NATO. He worked for many, many years in Ukraine as part of monitoring the civil conflict that I was talking to you about, and he challenges all of these claims that the Canadian government and the mainstream media are making about the war in Ukraine. So I bring these important resources to your attention. The other resource that I want to bring to your attention is this book written in 2015 by William Blum. So William Blum did work for the U.S. State Department. He was so appalled by U.S. foreign policy that he left the government and he launched an independent newspaper to challenge U.S. foreign policy. And the last book that he wrote before he died was this book, America's Deadliest Export, Democracy. If you follow the news about what Canada claims to be doing in Ukraine, and the reason why we're sending all of this money and all of this weapons to Ukraine is supposedly to protect their democracy. This is not the case, And the first chapter of this book by William Blum is about Ukraine, so I encourage you to read it. Canada and the United States have never been interested in protecting human rights and democracy in other countries, just like the Canadian government has never been interested in protecting democracy and human rights in this country. I'm so grateful that the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace say that NATO is the greatest threat to people and the planet, and why we need to create a national movement for Canada to withdraw from NATO and for NATO to be disbanded. So now I've only got like 5 minutes, and I've got to tell you a little bit about this incredible conference that I attended in Vienna 2 weekends ago, the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine. There were 800 people, 300 people in person, 500 people online. There were representatives from at least between 32 and 37 countries, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, from North America, from all across Europe, and people came together very much wanting to end this war in Ukraine, to find solutions, to talk honestly, to share resources, and find a way out of this. The theme of the conference was peace through peaceful means. Peace through peaceful means. So really challenging this dominant narrative that we need to continue to send weapons to Ukraine in order to achieve victory. We're all losing in this war. There were incredible high-profile people there, current and former diplomats, current and former members of the European Parliament. Does anybody know Claire Daly, the Member of Parliament for Ireland? She's so fiery and awesome. She was there in person. Oh, here she is here. There she is there. She's sitting on the stage with the amazing German diplomat who was the Assistant Secretary General for the United Nations, Michael von der Schulenburg, and Colonel Anne Wright, a senior advisor to the President of Mexico. The Vice President of Bolivia was there. There were incredible people from all walks of life coming together to try to build a movement, make connections to try to end this war in Ukraine. At the end of the conference, this is our big group photo, and you can see this banner here, "We Want Peace." This is a banner that I made just before I went to Vienna. And a group of us women, before I left Canada, we went and we stood in front of Parliament with the sign, "We Want Peace." We stood outside the US Embassy in Ottawa and the Russian Embassy in Ottawa and the Ukraine Embassy in Ottawa. "We Want Peace." And I've been taking this banner everywhere. We're putting it up on social media, letting everybody know that people are committed to peace. So I'm hoping tonight we can take a picture with this banner as well. The other banner that you see here is Peace for Climate Justice, Stop the War, Stop the Warming. This is a banner that I brought to the Sharm el-Sheikh Climate Summit in Egypt last November before I left to Russia. In this room in Vienna, this big conference, you can see that there's this elephant there in the background. The Norwegian WILF women brought this big inflatable elephant with a banner hanging off of it that says, "Militarism equals the elephant in the climate room." And many people took pictures of that. So people really connecting the climate crisis and war and militarism and the need to demilitarize, to decarbonize. At the end of this conference, we have a Vienna Appeal for Peace. We're taking it to our governments. When I was in Vienna, I asked for a meeting with the Canadian Embassy, and I met with the political attaché there and gave a copy of our appeal. We also met with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and let them know about this. There were, and we've come home with all of these great contacts and with resources. There was amazing things that people shared with us that they're doing in their countries and their communities trying to end this war. And this is not covered at all in our media. The peace voices are completely shut out. Before I went to Vienna, I sent a press release to 2,500 media outlets and journalists saying that this conference was taking place, that we were sending a representative. I was representing WILF Canada and VOW at this conference, and there was no media coverage at all. But I want to emphasize, friends, the reason why we need to end this war in Ukraine is because the IPCC synthesis report that I mentioned at the beginning of my conference said that the only way that we can deal with the climate emergency is if there is international cooperation. That report in March didn't say anything about military missions or war or militarism, but it did say that in order for us to address the climate emergency, we need to work collaboratively with all countries. That means we need to end the war in Ukraine and all of the wars, and we need to cooperate with Russia and with China. So remember I showed you that picture of all of that NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe? When I did my big tour of Russia and Eastern Europe, I was talking to hundreds of people. At the end of my trip, I mapped out all of the connections people told me about. Every single person that I spoke with said that they have a friend or family member back in Russia or in Ukraine or somewhere else in the Baltics. All over, they've got, this is what it looks like. NATO is sowing division and hostility and animosity in the region. And it's creating this new Iron Curtain and this new Cold War. And so what we need to do, because our governments aren't doing what they should be doing, and that is building peace, engaging in diplomacy, and ending this war, it is going to be up to us to do that. That is why I went to Russia. I went for the motivations of strategic empathy, people-to-people diplomacy, and peace building, to find ways that we can make peace. And just imagine if we replaced all of that NATO infrastructure with peacemakers and peace building and art and cultural exchanges and languages exchanges and trains and buses going back and forth. If that's what we were investing in and that's what we were doing for the past 30 years, how different things would be in the region. So I ended the trip. The last thing that I did on this 1-month trip is I was in Poland and I talked to a group of Ukrainian refugees. This is some of the men that I met with. And these are men from both sides of the contact line within Ukraine, the West and the East. So Ukrainian speaking and Russian speaking. They left the country because they don't want to fight each other, and they want peace, and they want the war to end. And they said, we are brothers. We don't want this war to continue. We want your government to stop sending weapons and to help bring about negotiations to end the war. So in order for us to do that, we need to strengthen the peace movement. We need to say no to NATO. We need to say no to these weapons exports. This is my sign with some of the peace people in Finland. This is in St. Petersburg with one of the Russian peace activists. What can we do? Lots of things. One of the things that I'm doing is I'm refusing to be enemies. I'm refusing to accept this new Cold War. I'm refusing to be enemies with Russia. I'm refusing to be enemies with China. I'm not going to have any fear. I'm going to make friends, and because I am concerned about the climate crisis. I am concerned about the poverty crisis. I want the money to be moved to protect people and the planet and not to be used for weapon systems and for war. So yesterday, or 2 days ago when I was in Vancouver, I met with the Mobilization Against War and Occupation. We did an action outside of Hedy Fry's office. We brought her a letter and we gave her our messages. NATO is going to be having their annual summit in Vilnius, July 11th and 12th. Women across Europe are going to be gathering in Brussels. Women United for Peace Against NATO, and they have a statement. They would love Canadian women to sign their declaration. They are going to be mobilizing, and I'm hoping that while they are mobilizing from July 7th to July 12th, that we do actions against NATO. Peace now. Stop the war, stop NATO between July 7th and July 12th. That weekend as well, there's going to be a global peace wave to counter the NATO summit, and it's no to militarization, yes to peace and cooperation. So you can sign up for this virtual global peace wave. And then finally, I want to encourage you to head down to Victoria, or when Dmitry Lisker Harris is down south to give his presentation, Making Peace with Russia, One Handshake at a Time. If you aren't able to go down to Victoria for that presentation, there will also be a virtual presentation on July 4th. So I've covered a lot of ground tonight. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, to hear your questions and comments. Thanks very much.